mirrors, I think, something that happens a lot with people who come at it from a different perspective than that of a black perspective. And if you get it through the lens of white feminism to start, sometimes it can get a little muddled. And so I figured I would offer that and sort of where I come from in that. So I sort of started out with sort of, I grew up in the girl power 90s, and so, you know, anything you can do, I can do better mentality. And so when I heard of feminism, I'm like, yeah, that sounds right, but you know, I don't want to be an extreme feminist. Oh no. You know, I don't want to burn any bras or anything. And then, you know, of course now I'm, you know, left of left of left of left. Yeah, now I'm the person people say they don't want to be like, because then they'll be too extreme. It's fun how that happens. But for me personally, like my encounters with it lately, the term intersectional, when it's used by people who are often not coming from good grounding in theory and good grounding in practice even, is you get people calling people intersectional to mean that they're multiply marginalized, which is such a ridiculous thing to say. Like people will say to me, oh, you're an intersectional person. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? And what they mean is I can be their token on multiple issues. You know, if they need a speaker who checks all the boxes, transmasculine, check, queer, check, brown, check, atheist, check, ex-Muslim, check. You know, they're like, all right, we just need this one speaker, and everyone else can be straight white men and we'll be fine. So that's where you get sort of the buzzword of it, and that's where you get people not really understanding where it comes from. Like, what, you can't call an individual person an intersectional person. That's not a thing. Intersectionality, you know, it's a practice, it's an understanding, it's a grounding. That's what it is. And so that's something that I've fallen into personally myself. Just because when I heard about it, it sounded good, just like with feminism. I was like, oh, this sounds good, maybe I can, you know, sort of figure out what it is. And then I had to really go back and, like, you know, to use a very bad analogy, have my come to Jesus moment. So when I think about intersectionality lately, I think of it more as the practice of inclusion, the practice of accommodation, the practice of ensuring that there are platforms and spaces. And actually, that's why I've been a bit adamant about everybody using the mic right now. Because one of the things I think about a lot is accessibility. And for people with auditory processing issues or any other, you know, auditory issues, you know, I used to be the person who said, oh, my voice is super loud, I'll just project. And that's really, really bad. And like, we have to be really mindful that that's not going to work for everybody. And to sort of go to my own background as an ex-Muslim, I think a lot about the criticism of Islam. And so this came up at Sadia's talk just now for the keynote that just happened. The question that came up at the end, of course, was there are people who are criticizing Islam from like sort of the wrong perspective or with the wrong intentions. And you know, how do we sort of parse that out? And so I think about it as sort of there's two facets of it, and they seem sort of obvious when you say it, but there's where you're coming from and where you're going when it comes to criticism of Islam specifically, and from an intersectional perspective. Where you're coming from matters in the sense of, you know, if you are literally a 1488 white supremacist and you're criticizing Islam, even if you're making decent arguments, I'm probably not going to take you very seriously, probably not promote what you're saying, unless I get tricked, which has happened, by the way. When I first was an ex-Muslim, I sort of accepted any attention I could get, and I went on a podcast, and it turned out, you know, partway through I realized, oh, these people are trying to get me to say, yes, we should expel all Muslims from all Western countries. And it's like, no, I'm not going to say that. And you know, it has happened since with people who are now not as much of a thing in the secular community, but you know, I went on a podcast once where it seemed like the guy was just trying to get me to give him a criticize all Muslims free card. He basically wanted me to say that it's a good idea to go up to random Muslims in the street, and by Muslims he means women in a headscarf, and say things like Muhammad was a pedophile, because to him this was shocking and would get them to challenge their ideas. And I sat there thinking, you know, you don't know what a woman in a headscarf's life is. You don't know what she's going through. You know, there was a period of my life where I was wearing a headscarf and I was a flaming atheist. I just didn't have any outlet. I didn't know what to do with my life. I was still living with my parents. So, you know, you don't really know where that person's coming from. And really, when has anyone ever deconverted because some white guy yelled that Muhammad was a pedophile? Literally, sounds fake, never happened. What really did get me to question my religion, though, was people in my life who I knew where they were coming from. So I had a lot of non-Muslim friends in high school, because the Muslims in my high school were actually really cruel to me, because I was a really sincere person, and I always have been, and that makes you a victim in a lot of ways. But I had a lot of friends who were, good people from non-Muslim backgrounds. That alone made me question Islam, That alone, just knowing that there were people who were nice, good people, I'm like, how can these people go to hell? This is awful. And then when 9/11 happened, which by the way was my second day of high school, so that really colored my experience, I had people coming up to me saying, we know you're a good person, we know your religion is of peace, but where are these hijackers coming from? And so that made me go and examine Islam, and then at the end of it, I came out an atheist. So, just thinking about where people are coming from, it matters. So when they make criticisms or ask questions, if they're coming from a different sort of place, you tend to interpret that differently. And the other question, of course, is where you're going. Why are you criticizing Islam? Is it so that Christianity can look better? Because there are certainly people doing that. And as I've become more savvy, I did accept going on some Christian's radio show, his talk show online. And he was trying to get me to criticize Islam in such a way that made Christianity sound good. And he and his audience were very annoyed when I kept saying, Christianity has that too. It's no different. It's just y'all don't practice what's in your book. You just ignore half of it. They really did not like that. But that's sort of the idea. It's where are you going with this criticism? Are you trying to help people who are in Islam question Islam? Are you trying to, like Sadia was talking about, criticize Islam in the means of saving people? Well, not saving, actually, we don't want to give people a white savior complex here. In the sort of helping give them resources and access to escape when they need it. Or are you just doing it to sort of, seem cool and edgy and, offend people for its own sake? Which I guess there's room for, but it's a lot less room than people think it is, in my humble opinion. So when we talk about culture too, like you mentioned, with culture, I think of culture as something that people use sometimes, especially well-intentioned white people, as an excuse, as something to honor above all others. Like when I was in college, I went to UC Irvine, which is, Derrida was there for a while. And if you know anything about Derrida, his influence has not died. His zombie lives on in the undergrads who gravely informed me that although my terrible experiences as an apostate with my family were certainly sad, I needed to respect my family's culture. And I remember looking at them saying, okay, so your white cultures are allowed to evolve, they're allowed to change, they're allowed to progress, they're allowed to, but brown cultures, we need to preserve them in amber, in the Stone Age. And so you guys can gawk at them like they're a cultural oddity. It's really insulting, it really is. And, so that's what people think of as sort of leftists on campus. That's what they're talking about, is these sort of really naive, multiculturalist ideals that, again, it comes from a place of naivete often, or sometimes because they just don't want to see what's in front of them. But I think of understanding culture as important in the sense of you need to understand where someone's coming from. There's a reason why people, a lot of times people of color have trouble finding good therapists. It's not because there aren't nice white therapists who are going to say, oh yes, that's your family's culture. They exist, they're everywhere. I've had to fire at least a dozen of them before finding my therapist. But what you don't have is a true understanding, is people who understand what it's like coming from communities of color, which often place less emphasis on the individual than white cultural communities. And I'm using white very broadly here, because one of my best therapists was Greek. She came from a culture that, was like mine, where, family matters and the individual matters a little bit less, perhaps. But I think of it as understanding the background of a person, but not dictating where they're allowed to go. Not trying to tell them how they can move forward. And so it comes back to this concept of intersectionality, is the idea that you can't separate someone's identities. And this comes up a lot in atheist circles where people say, well, atheism isn't necessarily feminist. And for me, that's just, I laugh at that, because to me, feminism had a lot to do with why I'm an atheist. I can't separate the theological